I'd like to welcome everyone to this meeting of the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, which is the student and youth wing of the Socialist Equality Party, the Australian section of the International Committee of the Fourth International. My name is Zach Hambides. I'm a National Committee member of the SEP, and I will be chairing tonight's meeting. Today's lecture is part of our series, Capitalism's War on Society, Why You Need to Fight for Socialism. We've had 3 lectures previously: the coronavirus pandemic, the necessity for socialism, the Russian Revolution and its significance for today, and last week's lecture, Socialist Alternative and the Politics of the Pseudo-Left. Now, if you haven't had a chance to view those lectures, or if you would like to listen to them again and review the critical content that is in them, all of those previous lectures have been posted on the IYSSC Australia Facebook page. Tonight's lecture is entitled Socialism versus Identity Politics and Postmodernism. Our speaker, as with the previous lectures, is Nick Beams, who is a National Committee member of the Socialist Equality Party, a regular and leading contributor on the World Socialist website, and has played a long-standing and leading role in the World Trotskyist movement. So I'll hand over to Nick now to give tonight's presentation. Nick?
Welcome to everybody here tonight. We made the point at the very beginning of this series that the coronavirus pandemic, like every crisis, has laid bare the essential social relations in society, revealing the produced by the festering of all the great contradictions lodged within it, covered over for decades. Under conditions where in all countries governments and the capitalist state have backstopped every area of the profit system, old and venerable entities have been exposed as palpable absurdities. Who can now seriously claim that the capitalist market must be the basis for the organisation of economic and social life? It has produced the life-threatening disaster engulfing health and hospital systems around the world. Furthermore, it has laid bare the absurdity of identity politics as practiced and preached by the pseudo-left over the past 4 decades. The basis of identity politics is that gender, sexual orientation, so-called national or racial identity form the very basic structure of society, not class relations and the economic and social structures that arise from those relations. The impact of the pandemic has revealed in the living experience of billions that class is the fundamental question. Yesterday, there was a significant comment posted on Bloomberg by a prominent journalist, Andreas Kluth. He wrote, I quote, "The most misleading cliche about the coronavirus is that it treats us all the same. It doesn't. COVID-19 exacerbates pre-existing conditions of inequality wherever it arises." And in a warning to the ruling classes, he continued, "Before long, this will cause turmoil, up to and including uprisings and revolutions." Just consider what has happened in the centre of global capitalism, the United States. Tens of thousands have died. Tens of millions of workers have been thrown into conditions not seen since the 1930s. But Wall Street has had a bonanza. Finance capital has been engaged in an orgy at a funeral. This has been made possible by government bailouts to the corporations to the tune of more than $2 trillion, with the prospect of still more to come, while the Fed has pumped trillions of dollars into financial markets. Since its nadir in mid-March, that is the stock market, these combined actions have led to the most rapid rise on Wall Street ever seen in history. The share traders, finance houses, speculators have raked in billions of dollars literally overnight. The Financial Times reported in the last couple of days on one such hedge fund that made $2.6 billion in a matter of days. Let me turn briefly to the broader implications of this crisis. It is made clear that such are the complexities and integrated character of modern society that it must be organised on a rational, scientific basis and consciously planned. But the present ruling classes and the insatiable drive for profit and private wealth arising from the social system based on class exploitation over which they preside make this necessity impossible to realise. Karl Marx long ago explained that the inherent logic of the capitalist system was the creation of fabulous wealth at one pole and poverty, misery, and degradation at the other. For more than a century, the ideologists of the bourgeoisie have denounced these conclusions. They have been answered in living reality. Consider for a moment other existential threats. Climate change, for one. It might perhaps have been thought that a rise in sea levels by a metre or so, flooding whole cities, was beyond the realms of possibility. Not so now, I would venture to suggest. What is the problem? It is not that humankind does not have the wit and wisdom to deal with such an existential threat. The problem is that the domination of society by corporate and financial oligarchs makes a rational solution based on science impossible. And what of the ever-present and ever-growing threat of war? In the light of what has happened in the last 6 weeks or so, can it be viewed as some kind of distant threat? Hardly. The danger arises from the fact that in response to this crisis, the various capitalist cliques organised in rival nation states and great powers are intensifying the struggle against each other. Here, the same issue arises. This cancer on human society that threatens to kill it must be removed through the taking of political power by the working class. This is the perspective that has been fought for indefatigably by the World Trotskyist movement over decades. So let us look briefly at what others have been doing. The so-called official political discourse, to use the term so beloved of postmodernism, has been dominated by the promotion of identity politics. In the period immediately before the coronavirus outbreak in the US, the central concern of the practitioners of racialist politics was that American capitalism was grounded on white privilege, that race, not class, is the fundamental division in society. And this privilege was rooted in the very DNA of American society, that the Revolution of 1776, which declared that all men are created equal with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, did not represent a step forward in the struggle for human emancipation, but was essentially a slaveholders' revolt. The New York Times placed this at the centre of its so-called 1619 project that it has sought to make the basis of teaching in schools and colleges about the American Revolution. The virus, however, does not recognise this white privilege. Its impact is determined by class. The workers, whatever their so-called racial identity, whatever their gender, whatever their sexual orientation, are most affected by the virus itself and its economic outcome. In New York, one of the epicenters of the coronavirus outbreak, the rate of infection and death is correlated with the areas of greatest social inequality. Billions of workers around the world, depending on weekly wages with little or no savings, are forced to work by economic necessity. They are placed in danger because of the absence of necessary measures to protect them due to the ravages inflicted by the ruling elites in the interest of profit. At the same time, the wealth and fortunes of this class are being protected by corporate and financial bailouts, which sooner rather than later will be paid for by the working population. This is not some mere assertion on my part. Its truth has been established in the events following 2008 when the working class was made to pay and the financial elites were first bailed out and then provided with still more money. The pandemic has exposed the rottenness, the absurdities of capitalist society. But it has also brought to the surface fundamental truths concealed from view in so-called normal times that now belong to a bygone era, never to return. The first of these truths is that labour, carried out by billions of working people the world over, is the basis of society. As Karl Marx succinctly noted, every child knows that a nation which ceased to work, I will not say for a year, but even for a few weeks, would perish. The crucial question that determines the social structure of every society, its foundational class relations, is how this necessary labour process is carried out and organised. In capitalist society, the means of production necessary for the labour process are owned by a distinct class, a tiny minority. The production process is therefore not organised to meet the needs of society, but profit. The Marxist movement, from the time of the publication of Das Kapital in 1867, has explained that the source of value and surplus value, the basis of profit, is the expenditure of labour power by the working class. Now, it's no exaggeration to say that from the time Marx unveiled the secret of surplus value, the whole of bourgeois economic theory has been devoted to either trying to refute this scientific truth or cover it up. Over the course of the past 4 decades, this ideological obfuscation has reached ever more fantastic heights. This period has been characterized, above all, by the process of financialization. In essence, this involves the drive by capital, in its financial form, to divorce itself from the actual material process of production. It seeks to escape from real, earthly value relations and enter a kind of heaven, where the accumulation of profit takes place through financial speculation and parasitism, very often by methods that have an outright criminal character. This has been accompanied by the manufacturing of a series of illusions, all of them based on the claim that value does not depend on human labour. It can somehow be created virtually in seconds, even nanoseconds, via a clever trade on financial markets. It is claimed that stocks, bonds, and other financial assets, including such arcane creations as derivatives, have an intrinsic value. Now, it's certainly true that vast fortunes are made in financial operations, but one must seek to penetrate this mystified world. This involves disclosing what these financial assets actually represent. They do not contain value in and of themselves. They are not value, but a claim on value, on the surplus value extracted from the labour of the working class in the process of production. In its own way, the bourgeoisie itself actually recognises this truth. After the massive corporate and financial bailouts in the US and around the world, the ruling classes are moving on to the next business, the return to the exploitation of labour power, no matter what the consequences for the working class. The phrase uttered by Trump, that the cure for the pandemic cannot be worse than the disease, has been repeated in one form or another around the world. In this country, Morrison refers to a snapback. Recently, as we reported on the World Socialist website, Sam Lovick, a former senior economist for the Australian biotech company CSL, told the Australian Financial Review that we should not be shy about balancing the economy against health. And by the economy, he means profit. As the ABC economics commentator Ian Verenda noted, ultimately the decision comes down to dollars. And that callous as these decisions are, they are being made right now in Canberra, London, Rome, Beijing, Madrid, Washington, Jakarta, Johannesburg, everywhere that COVID-19 has invaded populations. The basis of this death calculus is the recognition by the bourgeoisie that the debts incurred by the capitalist state to bail out the corporate and financial elites have to be paid for. Value must be pumped into these financial assets, and the source of that value is the working class. This means that the two major classes in society, the working class and the capitalist class, are heading for a massive confrontation of revolutionary proportions, the first signs of which are already apparent in the opposition of workers to the drive to have them return to work in unsafe conditions. The state has already assumed massive control of the economy. The nostrums of the free market have been cast aside even by the bourgeoisie itself. So the burning question of the hour is, who's going to control the levers of the state? Will they remain in the hands of the present ruling class, or must they be torn from its grip in the struggle to establish a new state, a worker state, acting in the interest of society as a whole? Here we come to another fundamental truth discovered by Marx. He did not merely uncover the mechanism for the exploitation of the working class, but in so doing laid bare why it is a revolutionary class. In words that resonate powerfully in the present situation, he wrote in 1845, "It is not a question of what this or that proletarian, or even the whole proletariat, at the moment regards as its aim. It is a question of what the proletariat is and what, in accordance with this being, it will historically be compelled to do. Its aim and historical action is visibly and irrevocably foreshadowed in its own life situation, as well as in the whole organization of bourgeois society today." If the central thrust of bourgeois ideology in the sphere of political economy has been to attack the Marxist labour theory of value, it can equally be said that the pseudo-left and identity politics has been devoted to a renunciation of the revolutionary role of the working class. One of the most influential sources of this was the book by the post-Marxist academics Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, entitled Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, published in 1985. There were others appearing at the same time, such as the book by the French petty bourgeois radical André Gortz with the title Farewell to the Working Class. These politics are intimately connected with another of the reactionary ideological trends of the present day, postmodernism. It was defined by Jean-Francois Lyotard as a profound incredulity to all meta-narratives. What he meant by a meta-narrative was the study of history and the development of society as a law-governed process, as had been developed by Marx and Engels in their elaboration of the materialist conception of history. Profound incredulity in such an approach meant there was no objective historical truth that had to be discovered, only various forms of discourse, just different ways of talking about the past and present society, all equally valid. The central thesis advanced by Laclau and Mouffe was that it was necessary to discard the idea of any socio-economic basis for the struggle for socialism, and that fundamental interests in socialism cannot be logically deduced from determinate positions in the economic process. In the preface to the reissue of the book in 2000, they wrote that the rereading of Marxist theory in the light of contemporary problems necessarily involves deconstructing the central categories of that theory. Many issues and social antagonisms they maintain belong to the fields of discurvity in which are external to Marxism and cannot be reconceptualized in terms of Marxist categories. Couched in the mumbo-jumbo of postmodernism, in which there is no objective reality, only discourse, this means down with a materialist analysis of the class structure of capitalist society and in with various forms of identity politics, nationality, ethnicity, gender, etc. It is highly significant that these retrograde conceptions were raised in the mid-1980s, just as the process of financialization and its associated mystifications were getting into full swing. But their origin goes back further, to crucial issues of historical perspective that erupted with the founding of our movement, the Fourth International, in 1938. In 1939, a dispute broke out within the American section, the Socialist Workers' Party, over the class nature of the Soviet Union. In Revolution Betrayed, Trotsky had analysed the USSR as a degenerated workers' state. He insisted that, notwithstanding the monstrous crimes and betrayals of the Stalinist bureaucracy, the chief conquest of the October Revolution, that is, nationalised property relations, remained intact. Against this analysis, a new perspective was advanced by two members of the SWP, James Burnham and Max Shachtman, the ideological godfathers of the Socialist Alternative Group, whose politics we discussed last week. They maintained that the Stalinist apparatus was not a caste, a cancerous growth on the workers' state, but a new ruling class, either state capitalist or bureaucratic collectivist. The designation of the Soviet Union as a new form of class society had vast implications. If it was, in fact, ruled by a new class, entirely unanticipated by Marxism, this meant that Marxism's entire perspective, based on the revolutionary role of the working class, was invalid. Its revolutionary potential had either been completely exhausted or had never existed in the first place. In the years and decades which followed, this political perspective metastasized like a cancer, assuming new forms, but all with the same essential content. The working class was not a revolutionary social class capable of the construction of a socialist society. Now, it's not possible here to go through all the forms taken by this perspective over the succeeding decades. I urge that for further elaboration, you purchase the book, The Frankfurt School, Postmodernism, and the Politics of the Pseudo-Left, authored by David North. The skepticism in and outright hostility to the revolutionary role of the working class has formed the basis of all petty bourgeois left politics since it was enunciated 80 years ago. One of the most important conclusions of David North's book, one among many, is that in dealing with the latest form of this politics, identity politics, we are not simply dealing with wrong theories. These theories are anchored in definite class and social forces whose material interests they expressed. Last week, a question was raised about Lenin's analysis of what he called the aristocracy of labour. There was no one more vociferous than Lenin in his denunciation of the betrayals of the Social Democratic and Labour parties when they aligned themselves with their own bourgeoisie in the slaughter of World War I. But Lenin was a Marxist. He understood that such a monumental betrayal could not be put down to bad individuals. It had to have material and social roots. They were to be found in the very structure of capitalist society at that time. The development of imperialism, the extraction of enormous wealth from the colonies by the major capitalist powers enabled them to bribe privileged layers within the petty bourgeoisie and an upper stratum of the working class itself. These layers had a material interest in the maintenance of capitalism and formed the social basis of the betrayals of the social democratic parties. We must apply the same method in revealing the material roots of identity politics and its hostility to the working class. There's been a great deal of focus on the accumulation of wealth at the heights of society, and rightly so. Social inequality has risen to historically unprecedented levels. But the characterization of the division of society as being between the 1% and the 99% is false. It obscures fundamental features of present-day capitalism. There is not just a 1%, there is an upper 10%. And it includes not only the ultra-wealthy, but comprises also an upper middle-class layer, the next 9%, that has acquired, as a product of financialization, access to considerable wealth and income. To be sure, this does not approach the fantastic wealth of the top 1%, but compared to the 90% who constitute the working class, they've been doing relatively well. Just consider one statistic from the US. The cohort of the 90% to the 99% earn incomes of up to $433,000 and own more wealth than the bottom 90% combined. It is in this layer that identity politics is rooted. So what's their struggle all about? They are not seeking an overturn of capitalist property relations. They are waging a fight within the upper 10% for a greater portion of the wealth of society, siphoned to the upper echelons, to be channeled their way. Identity politics, a greater role for women, people of colour, etc., in the upper echelons of politics, business and the arts, is one of the means they hope to obtain such a redistribution of wealth and income. Consider one such movement, the organisation Black Lives Matter, which has attracted international support, including in this country. Now, many people looking for a way to fight make mistakes in assessing the real role played by various organisations that claim to be fighting against oppression and injustice. Now, that's not their fault. But I would say to such people, think again. And in that rethinking, recognise that the ruling class does not make such errors. It knows from years of experience precisely who it is dealing with. In 2016, the Ford Foundation, which has operated as an agency of US imperialism for decades, announced it was making $100 million available to Black Lives Matter over 6 years. We want to nurture bold experiments and help the movement build the solid foundation that will enable it to flourish, it said. And there's money to be made. In February 2017, Black Lives Matter launched a black debit card underwritten by One United Bank. The stated aim of the venture is to organise the $1.2 trillion in spending power of black people. As for the Me Too movement, it comprises a struggle waged by sections of upper middle class women in the field of politics, business, academia and the arts to acquire greater wealth, power and prestige. Now, at the conclusion of last week's discussion, there was an interjection by a supporter of Socialist Alternative and Me Too. It was, "Why do you defend rapists?" We do no such thing. What we oppose is the destruction of people's lives and careers on the basis of unproven allegations of rape and other forms of sexual assault. The reactionary political role of such allegations has been made abundantly clear in the case of Julian Assange. Baseless sex allegations supported by Socialist Alternative that have played a vital role in railroading him into Belmarsh prison. Then we are told the victims have the right to be believed. No, they do not. They have the right to have their allegations seriously heard and not have them summarily dismissed, as has so often been the case in the past, on the grounds that, such as, she was wearing a short skirt and was asking for it. They have the right to have their complaint properly investigated. But if, as the advocates of Me Too and others insist, the person in question has the right to be believed, an important line is crossed. It means the abrogation of the fundamental rights of any accused person. That is, the presumption of innocence in any judicial proceedings, that those proceedings must be properly conducted, and the case against that person must be proved beyond reasonable doubt. A democratic right fought for in decades of struggle. In conclusion, let me draw a balance sheet of the experience of last week's meeting, through which many of you here tonight passed. Unable to answer the political issues we had raised, Socialist Alternative supporters sought to disrupt the meeting. However, we should not describe this behaviour as simply due to bad individuals. It expresses broad social processes. The grounds of politics have shifted fundamentally. The conditions that enabled the domination of petty bourgeois left politics over the working class are being shattered. The fake socialist Bernie Sanders, as we predicted, yesterday gave his endorsement to Joe Biden. The working class is starting to emerge once again as an independent and revolutionary force, asserting its interests, and the practitioners of identity politics and their supporters in the pseudo-left fear this above all else. That is the source of their hostility to our party, because it articulates those interests, the needs of society as a whole, in a theoretical, programmatic, and organisational form. Thank you.
We'd now like to open up this meeting for questions that deal with these major issues that confront the working class and confront anyone who is seeking to enter into socialist politics, particularly students and young people on the campuses. So we do have one question that was sent in actually before the lecture began. It's a questioner by the name of Jay, who asks, do Marxists agree with the use of concepts like structural racism and white skin privilege to critique racism in contemporary society? And then the questioner has another question. What is your opinion of Noel Ignatiev's work attacking whiteness from a putatively Marxist perspective?
Yes. Well, first point, Marxists do not agree with the concept of white skin privilege. We insist that race is a social construct. Now, having said that, the racial prejudice, oppression, certainly exists. The issue is, how is it to be fought? What I'd like to do is begin my remarks by quoting from a leading black artist and intellectual of the Harlem Renaissance, Claude McKay, who stated in 1919, in words that have a great relevance for us today, "Every Negro," he wrote, "should make a study of Bolshevism and explain its meaning to the coloured masses. It is the greatest and most scientific idea afloat in the world today. Bolshevism has made Russia safe for the Jew. It has liberated the Slav peasant from the priest and bureaucrat who can no longer egg him on to murder Jews to bolster up their rotten institutions. It might make these United States safe for the Negro if the Russian idea should take hold of the white masses of the Western world. Then the black toilers would automatically be free. Now, I'm not familiar with the work of Noel Ignatieff, but I do agree with the fundamental point on which his work is based. That is that race is a social construct, not a scientific reality. So far as biological differences are concerned, I recall reading once, and this is only from memory, that so far as DNA is concerned, the differences are equivalent to a full stop in a page of a large book. It is a social construct. How did it arise? It developed with the growth of capitalism. The Great French Revolution of 1789, which swept away the old order, promoted liberty, equality, and fraternity. But what developed with the development of capitalism was not equality, but great inequality, the growth of an impoverished working class. And in the aftermath of the French Revolution, as it was taking place actually, how was this then justified? How was it to be explained? Well, you could say the founder of racial theory, inequality of races, etc., was a minor French aristocrat, Arthur Gobineau. What did he write? He said, "It has already been established that every social order is founded upon three original classes, each of which represents a racial variety. Nobility, a more or less accurate reflection of the conquering race; the bourgeoisie, composed of mixed stock, coming close to the chief race; and the common people who live in servitude, or at least in a very depressed position. Those last belong to a lower race, which came about in the South, mainly through miscegnation with the Negroes, and in the North with the Finns." Now, this concept, this reactionary concept, and was rooted in class divisions, developed further in the 19th century. I'll just quote from a little piece from a Saturday Review magazine of the mid-19th century Victorian England, which had wide circulation in the English middle classes. They said, "The Bethnal Green poor are a caste apart, a race of whom we know nothing, whose lives are of quite different complexion from ours, persons with whom we have no point of contact." So that was the issue. Then, of course, this was further developed in the 19th century, and in the 20th century in particular. We had the pseudo-scientific theories of eugenics, which sought to explain racial differences, so-called, on the basis of DNA and so on. The issue was also raised, and I'd just like to conclude with this, in one of the great songs of the civil rights movement, Bob Dylan's "Only a Pawn in Their Game." And he, in that song, so succinctly summed up the class role of racial politics. He wrote in the second verse, "A South politician preaches to the poor white man. You've got more than the blacks, don't complain. You're better than them. You've been born with white skin," they explain. And the Negro's name is used, it is plain, for the politician's game as he rises to fame, and the poor white remains on the caboose of the train. but it ain't him to blame. He's only a pawn in their game. And of course, that very succinctly sums up the role of racial politics, the divisions of the working class. Now we have the kind of flip side of that now, where this type of racial politics is now promoted by the so-called organs of liberal opinion, such as the New York Times. Its fundamental aim is the division of the working class, the prevention of its unification in the fight for socialist politics, as was so clearly outlined by Claude McKay, who I cited at the beginning of my remarks.
So there are a number of other questions that have come in. So one that I wanted to pose to Nick is from an attendee by the name of MC. Nick, can you talk about how the destruction of the search for objectivity and scientific truth in large layers of the intelligentsia and the connection between this phenomena and the nature of the lies, half-truths, equivocation, prevarications we are hearing about in relationship to COVID-19?
Yeah, well, I think this is very much a part, it's a good question. It's very much a part of this politics, which eschews and opposes the development of an objective analysis in capitalist society, its movement and its development, and focuses upon, as I said, factors such as race, identity, and politics. There is a repudiation in all of these layers of fundamental gains that were made in a preceding period. It's linked above all in these circles to the attack on the Enlightenment of the 18th century. Previously, in the preceding period, the rise of the bourgeoisie was accompanied by the development of science. And that took place, above all, because the bourgeoisie, in its rise to power, had an interest in the development of the productive forces. It was the basis of its rule. And science was crucial to that. That meant it had to overthrow and attack the conceptions that nature was governed by God. And of course, the feudal ruling classes sought to defend such positions. That's why Galileo, a scientist, a pioneer of modern science, was shown the instruments of torture. But the great thinkers of that time went further, and they sought to understand society in which they lived. They made the important breakthrough in understanding that society was not a result, as had been taught by the church, of the great chain of being, but was in some way actually created by human activity. Now, they saw that very much in an idealist form as the development of ideas and so on, but it was a fundamental breakthrough. And the great gain of that period, it's reflected in politics, it's reflected in philosophy, it's reflected in the founders of political economy, such as Adam Smith, who maintained that there were objective laws of this society which could be discovered objectively, that existed outside of the consciousness of men and women. Now, we've seen, as I said, an attack on these fundamental conceptions is absolutely essential to identity politics. And so, if you have that in one area, you have it in all areas of society. What is the issue today? That society must be scientifically planned and organized and developed consciously. However, that cannot be done because there is a fundamental impediment to that conscious organization in the existence of an outmoded and reactionary class that has become completely outmoded and a barrier to further progress, such as was the French nobility in the 1789 revolution. So we have this concept, this lying takes place, permeates all aspects of society. It's not only lying about COVID-19, it's the obscuring of fundamental truths about the operations of capitalist society itself. We have the concept of fictitious capital, arcane instruments, as I said, shares and so on, which are supposed to contain value in and of themselves. They are entirely fictitious entities. As we said, they're not value, they're a claim on value. And so this permeates, this atmosphere permeates the whole of society. So you have, in a sense, the sort of organic expression of this in Donald Trump, who gets up and spouts 100 lies a day. But he's only the expression, the most crude, obscene expression of the type of thinking that now permeates the whole of bourgeois politics, the whole of bourgeois society, and the intelligentsia, the intellectuals in the universities, who now proclaim in lecture halls and rostrums that there's no such thing as objective truth, that man can understand, yes, scientific developments in nature, scientifically, but it's impossible to scientifically understand the laws of society. And so lying becomes a way of life. And of course, the lie, as Trotsky explained, always serves a political role. It's there to bolster, maintain the rule of the bourgeoisie itself and its domination over the working class.
I think these questions and the lecture itself has really raised fundamental questions of theory, of philosophy, of history. And I just wanted to turn everyone's attention back to the book that Nick mentioned in his lecture, in which a lot of the concepts, the theory, even the figures that Nick has gone through are dealt with in a great deal of detail. And you can see it displayed here on your screen: the Frankfurt School, Postmodernism, and the Politics of the Pseudo-Left, a Marxist critique by David North. And that is available through mering@aussiemail.com.au. You can place your order if you're in Australia through that. Otherwise, you can do it through mering.com. And in addition, the new pamphlet that has been published by the World Socialist website, the New York Times' 1619 Project, a racialist falsification of American and world history, which is also available through the same channels. You can make your purchase through there. And I'd really encourage those here to continue your study and your examination of these questions through that literature, and send us your contact details so we can assist you in the study and development of your Marxist library. Now, the next question that I wanted to take is a quite direct one. It simply says, why does the Socialist Equality Party support Harvey Weinstein?
Well, the issue in the Harvey Weinstein case is, in every sense, a sort of, I think one article by David Walsh said it should have ended up in psychological counselling rather than a court of law. Because what the trial revealed was that Harvey Weinstein, yes, certainly used and abused these women. But the women in turn also used Harvey Weinstein to try and advance their positions. The issues we took up in the case of Harvey Weinstein, and was not a defense of Harvey Weinstein, what the issue we took up was the following, and there was a very important article by Eric London on this question, which examined the trial. And the trial was not conducted with any relationship to what we call due process. That is the right of a fair trial, the right of someone who's, after all, being put on trial for, effectively in Harvey Weinstein's case, for their life. He's going to spend the rest of his life possibly in jail. At least that's the extent of the sentence. But the trial was a complete abrogation of fundamental democratic procedures. For example, the jury was not sequestered. That is, it was not isolated from the furor going on outside. How could it arrive at an objective verdict? There were contradictions, as Eric London's article points out, in the decisions of the jurors. Why was it not sequestered? Why were other people not related to the case on trial, the actual events that were being tried, but to other issues relating to Harvey Weinstein? Why were they able to come into court and explain their experiences in relation to him, whether real or not, or whatever? These were never examined. So the point we raised was, the essential point we raised was that this was not a trial conducted on the basis of due process. That's the issue.
We have another question on the theme of Me Too. One questioner is posing a challenge to the analysis that was presented tonight. JR says, the Me Too movement is based upon the economic and political progression of the upper middle class tier of women. Despite the well-documented evidence of the systemic failure of the current system in providing justice to such a pressing social issue in society, the majority of your speech and point was fantastic, but this aspect really was abhorrent. So some further clarification should be appreciated. So questioning the identification of the Me Too movement as being based in the upper middle class.
Well, the socialist movement, long before Me Too came on the scene, has always explained that capitalist society involves the suppression of women. Friedrich Engels, the collaborator of Karl Marx, I think, raised the point that the measure of any progress of society can be gauged by its treatment of women. But as I said in regard to Black Lives Matter, their mistakes are made in identifying such movements with an actual struggle to end that oppression. That's not what Me Too is about. Quite frankly, they couldn't give a damn about the oppression of working class women who are now on the front lines, endangered by this virus, at the very forefront of this war, ill-equipped. Has Me Too come out with a statement denouncing this development, exposing the rot of capitalist society, which has exposed countless working class women to the dangers that they encounter? No, it has not. It is a struggle, as I said, waged within upper echelons of the upper echelons of society, in this 10% for a greater portion of wealth and income, prestige, power to be channeled in their direction. That's what it's about. The liberation of women, this lifting of sexual relations to a higher level, can only be carried forward through the development of a socialist society. Me Too and all of its adherents are opposed to that perspective because they're opposed to the working class. They benefit from the processes of financialization, which have led to the impoverishment of the working class, the worsening conditions of women. They benefit from that, and they're striving to defend it, enhance their position within that system of exploitation. Let me just give you, for example, let's conduct a little thought experiment. Let us suppose that all the demands of Me Too were met, that throughout society, in politics, there was, 52% of women. In big business, chief executives, there was 52% of women. In the arts and films, they were directed, produced, and so on, 52% women. Now, what would change in terms of the fundamental structure of capitalist society? Nothing. The same system of exploitation would remain. The same attacks on working class women would remain, because these attacks flow not from sex, but from class issues, from the social structure of society itself, which would not be changed one iota if all the quotas of the various identity politics movements were met.
We have a question from JC who asks, is it possible that those involved in identity politics will be won over to Marxism? Or will it be a case of explaining to the working class the trap of identity politics only?
Well, one always lives in hope that forces and people who have had positions to which we're opposed will change their minds. But in terms of, and we're dealing always with broad social trends and tendencies, no, it won't. There won't be a shift. In fact, what will happen as the class antagonisms develop and intensify, these organizations will move more hostile, become more hostile to the working class. Because, you see, politics is not, I raised this point last week, I think, politics is not about fundamentally a battle of ideas, good ideas versus bad ideas. It is expressed, yes, in ideas, in politics, in theories, but those theories and those politics are the expression of the interests of different social classes and different social forces. For particular adherents of Me Too to come over to the side of socialist politics, they've got to make a fundamental class break from the milieu, the politics in which they operate. So, yes, individuals may make that break, but the movement as a whole, no, because it's anchored in fundamental social forces that benefit from the intensified exploitation of the working class, the wealth that is siphoned up from the working class as a whole is the basis of their privileged existence. And we know that that's not going to be given up. As I said, individuals may, but these broad tendencies, no.
There's another question which I think will hopefully prompt many to turn to the books. BE asks, can you go into what the theory of state capitalism was exactly? What is the theory of state capitalism?
Well, it was a theory that said that a new class had been created. That is a state capitalist society. This class emerged through a new stratum that had developed in which the power of the state was held by this new grouping, and it used that state to accumulate its privileges and its position. But the point, and it was bound up with broad tendencies that were taking place at the same time in 1939 when this arose in the Socialist Workers' Party. There was the statization, you could say, of the economy in Nazi Germany under Hitler. There was also another phenomenon, the development of the Roosevelt administration in the United States, in which it appeared that the state was now the controller and owner of the means of production. But of course, there were fundamental differences. You see, if it's a new class, Trotsky explained this in the following way. Every class in society and ruling classes emerge because at a certain point they play a role in the development of the productive forces. And that goes for the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie was a necessary historical class at a certain point in history. It overthrew feudalism and carried out, on the basis of new property relations, a fundamental and decisive development of the productive forces. And let's give the bourgeoisie its due. In the past, it created, through that development, the necessary material basis for socialism in the future. Now, the Stalinist bureaucracy held the levers of state power in the Soviet Union. But it was not a new class. It did not own the means of production. These still remained nationalized. That had not been carried out by the Stalinist bureaucracy. The overturning of capitalist social relations had been carried out by the working class in the Revolution of October 1917. Every ruling class in a certain period of history plays, as I said, with regard to the bourgeoisie, and you could say the same about feudalism before it, plays a progressive role in that it develops the productive forces. It is a necessary class. The Stalinist bureaucracy had no necessity whatsoever. In fact, from its very birth, it was not a force that developed the productive forces in the Soviet Union. Through its bureaucratic mismanagement, its blind empiricism and pragmatism, it literally produced one disaster after another from the time of its assertion of power in 1923, 1924 onwards. And of course, the confirmation of Trotsky's analysis came in 1991. Trotsky had said with the liquidation of the Soviet Union, in 1936, Trotsky had explained in Revolution Betrayed that the Soviet Union was not a new class society, it was a society in transition. And two roads opened up. He explained that either the working class would overthrow this cancer, this excrescence upon the workers' state, and resume the fight for socialist construction that it had begun in 1917, or if the bureaucracy maintained its position, it would inevitably and necessarily carry out the restoration of capitalism. Now, of course, that just seemed very far-fetched in 1936 when these words were written and when that perspective was outlined. Great luminaries such as the Fabians, Sidney and Beatrice Webb in England, were writing paeans of praise to the new civilization in Russia. But of course, in a historically very short period of time, 55 years, Trotsky's position was absolutely vindicated. The bureaucracy liquidated the Soviet Union and transformed state-owned property that had been developed by the working class into capitalist private property. The confirmation of Trotsky's analysis was confirmed in that historical development.
We have another question here from CJ, who's asking, what source can you recommend for me to understand exactly how the proletariat are being systematically exploited? What systems and structures are being exploited by the elite to widen the income inequality gap? And again, I just want to point listeners and attendees' attention to the screen where we're displaying Merring.com and merring@aussiemail.com.au. This is the avenue by which you can develop and widen your Marxist library to study and work through these, important and complex theoretical questions. So, Nick, if you could give an indication to our listener where they could go to study these questions.
Yeah. Well, of course, the starting point for the study of political economy is Marx's Capital. And it's hard going. but that's a foundation. But there are other introductions that you could make. There's the book by Trotsky, which this title just escapes me for the moment, in which he does a précis of Marx's work. There are, of course, the very important chapters and the whole of the book, but Anti-During by Friedrich Engels. There's Marx's Wage, Labour and Capital, Value, Price and Profit. But of course, Marxism is ongoing and developing. It's not a series of dogmas written for all time and sort of carved out in stone. We have to make a continual analysis of the development of capitalist society. And we have written extensively on the World Socialist website on this process of financialization, the development of finance capital over the past period, the ways in which this exploitation is carried out, and particularly this development over the past years. So there's that to be examined as well. You can conduct work on the World Socialist website. You'll see many articles that I've written, other people have written on this process. But essentially, I think what's important about the situation today is that we see now the fundamentals of the Marxist critique of capitalism covered over. As I said, this crisis has not only revealed absurdities, it's also revealed truths. That labour is the source of value. That the labour power of the working class is the source of the exploitation of the work, of the source of profit, and the ultimate source of all the fortunes of finance capital which they claim. So I begin there. I particularly would be important to read Anti-During by Friedrich Engels. If you want to go further, read Marx's Capital and the other pamphlets that I mentioned.
I believe, Nick, that work by Trotsky you were referring to is Marxism in Our Time, which is available on the... That's the one?
That's the one, yes. Yes, so yeah. Thank you, Zach. That's a very, very, very good introduction. I would recommend that you get it and read it, and Trotsky's explanation. You can also, of course, read Rosa Luxemburg's What is Economics as a very good and important introduction. I think her work is possibly online, and so on. But yes, Marxism in Our Time by Leon Trotsky, a very good starting point.
Now, all of these works are available either through Mering.com or through the World Socialist website. But I think the most important book that you could buy and begin to study is the Statement of Principles of the Socialist Equality Party, which outlines the fundamental programmatic and political basis for joining and becoming a member of the SEP. And through that process, we will educate you as Marxists on all of these questions that Nick has raised here tonight. Just in taking us out, Nick, I've got one final question from an FX. He notes Slavoj Zizek has released a new book on the coronavirus pandemic. In his book, he proposed the notion of communism disaster as an antidote to the current disaster capitalism. He refers to the need of urgent global coordination between states instead of an isolated me-first solution. And he also proposes producing resources outside of market coordination. Our questioner asks, do you have any other proposals for a socialist movement and how it could respond to this global traumatic event?
Yes, we've explained, firstly on Zizek. I mean, this man is a sort of mixture of, I don't know how to describe it, postmodern politics, a kind of an intellectual charlatan. But when it comes down to the question of politics, he's very clear. Go back to when Obama came to power. Zizek was an enthusiastic supporter of Obama. He lined up with all the others who said The coming to power of Obama was a transformative moment. We might note, just in regard to Obama and his support for him, that inequality among the black population in the United States escalated under the first transformative black president. For example, the Federal Reserve Board in the United States reported that from 2007 to 2016, a period largely covered by the Obama administration, the top 1% of the black population saw its share of the total African American wealth grow from 19.4% to 40.5%. We noted in an article the levels of wealth inequality among African Americans and other minority groups in the US are even more pronounced than inequality among whites. We quoted a statistic: a black family in the top 1% is worth a staggering 200 times that of an average black family. If Black America were a country, we would be among the most wealth stratified in the world. So the issue again is class, not race. The differentiation, the inequality in black and minority communities in the US is the same. We have the same process in Australia in regard to the indigenous population. One of the great tasks of the socialist movement is to take forward the emancipation of the indigenous population of this country. All of the measures introduced by the bourgeoisie have been aimed at one thing only: cultivating a privileged stratum in the upper layers of the Aboriginal and Indigenous population, not, as every statistic shows, improving the conditions of some of the most oppressed people in the world. Now, what's our perspective? Our perspective is that this obstacle to the rational planning and scientific organisation of society, its conscious development to meet human need and not profit, must be removed. In the same way that in an earlier period, in the 18th century in France, the feudal-based ruling class had to be removed. It had become a complete obstacle to further progress of society, and it was removed through revolution. That's the issue today. What's the issue facing us in climate change? Everyone knows that a solution must be developed on the basis of science, rational planning. We can do that, but we can't do it while the means of production remain under private ownership. The major corporations, which I think contribute about 70% of global pollutants, have to be brought into public ownership, and these corporations and these factories and so on, organised in collaboration and on the basis of, accord with the laws of nature itself. That can't be done under capitalism. So the first issue, the principal issue, is this: in order to reconstruct society, the working class has to take political power in its hands. Now, I've mentioned the French Revolution and bourgeois revolutions, but here we must note a fundamental difference. The bourgeoisie developed within the confines of feudal society. It was able to build up its economy, the market, bourgeois economy, within feudal society itself, and on the basis of that economic power, it was able to take political power and lead to a further development. That road doesn't exist for the working class. You can't develop the sort of outlines of a socialist economy within capitalism. No, firstly, the working class must take political power and then use that power to reconstruct society on socialist foundations. And above all, that must be done internationally. We have to abolish national state divisions. But that can only be done if the bourgeoisie is overthrown, because the bourgeoisie and its rule is rooted in the nation-state system. That must be abolished, and we must establish a world socialist republics. It's not going to happen all at once on any given day, but it has to be developed. And each revolution, as it develops in every country, must be seen and developed and fought for as a component part of this global movement. That's why, of course, we're implacably hostile to all forms of racism, all forms of nationalism, which seek to divide and split the working class in the face of this task. So the conquest of political power, the establishment of workers' governments around the world, which can then organise production on a global scale in the interests of humanity.
Now, I just want to emphasize that we've been continuing these discussions in IYSSE group meetings and club meetings throughout the week. Griffith University this Thursday at 1:30. University of Melbourne will be having their meeting on Friday at 1 o'clock, and next week on Monday at 1 o'clock is a joint meeting of all the clubs in New South Wales. That's the University of Newcastle, Macquarie University, WSU, as well as UNSW. Now, the next meeting that we're holding is the final in this series. It is on Tuesday at 7 p.m. Sydney time. It is entitled The US Election Campaign of the Socialist Equality Party. And we're very pleased to be announcing that we will have the participation of our presidential candidate, Joseph Key-Shore, who is standing in the US elections as the candidate for the Socialist Equality Party. In addition, if you have not done so already, you should make sure you register for our upcoming May Day celebration, which in Sydney time will take place at the unenviable hour of 1 a.m. on Sunday, May the 3rd. However, that does mean that it won't conflict with any pre-existing arrangements, and so you will be free to attend. I really encourage everyone here to attend this truly international live online rally, which is the May Day event. The link and the information for that is available on the website. And just in ending, I wanted to really emphasize these lectures have posed to you how the capitalist class, how the defenders of the capitalist class, whether that's in the form of the pseudo-lefts, in identity politics, the various postmodernist theories and tendencies, how they have responded to the crisis of capitalism from the standpoint of the defense of their privileges and their interests. But the most important question is the question of what you decide to do. And now is the time for you to take up the fight for socialism, which means, making the application to join the Socialist Equality Party. The working class needs, above all, a revolutionary leadership, and that can articulate a perspective for genuine socialism against all those of the Chantal Mouffe, the Me Too movements, the 1619 projects, etc. And by making your application to join, you begin the process of developing yourself as a Marxist and as a leader. I want to do, on behalf of everyone who's participating here tonight and in previous nights, thank Nick Beams for his lecture. Thank you for your answers to these questions. It has been very enlightening, very engaging, and to also thank everyone here who has taken part.